The lighthouse beam swept across the black water for the last time that night, and Marcus Holloway saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A massive shadow moved beneath the waves, something far too large to be a whale, far too deliberate to be debris. It rose toward the surface with an intelligence that chilled him to the bone, then vanished into the depths as suddenly as it had appeared. Marcus gripped the iron railing of the lighthouse gallery, his knuckles white against the salt-corroded metal. The beam continued its mechanical rotation, casting long fingers of light across the restless Atlantic, but the ocean below revealed nothing more than endless darkness. Yet he knew what he'd seen. After 37 years of keeping the light at Deadman's Point, he'd learned to trust his eyes, even when his mind begged him not to. The wind howled through the lighthouse structure, carrying with it the acrid smell of rotting kelp and something else. Something organic and wrong that made his stomach turn. The massive lens assembly groaned as it turned its century-old gears, grinding with a sound like breaking bones. Far below, waves crashed against the jagged rocks with a violence that seemed personal, as if the ocean itself was angry. Marcus descended the spiral staircase, each step echoing in the hollow tower like a countdown. His radio crackled with static, the Coast Guard frequency, nothing but white noise and fragments of distant voices. The isolation that had once brought him peace now felt like a trap. Deadman's Point light station sat 3 miles from shore on a rocky outcrop connected to civilization by nothing but a narrow causeway that disappeared beneath the waves at high tide. Welcome back to the Channel Night Owls. I'm coming to you live from the edge of madness itself. Before we dive into tonight's terror, tell me, where are you watching from? Are you safe in your warm bed, or are you somewhere dark like me? Hit that like button if you're brave enough to hear what lurks beneath the waves, and subscribe if you want more true horror that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the ocean's depths. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never look at water the same way again. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had arrived at Deadman's Point with nothing but a duffel bag and a desire to disappear from the world. The divorce papers were still fresh in his jacket pocket, along with the termination letter from the Boston Harbor Authority. 37 years of marriage, 28 years of lighthouse keeping, all reduced to official documents, and the bitter taste of failure. The lighthouse stood like a bone-white finger against the gray November sky, its red brick base weathered by decades of Atlantic storms. Built in 1847, Deadman's Point Light had guided ships safely past the treacherous Widow's Teeth, a series of razor-sharp rocks that had claimed over 200 vessels throughout history. The automated beacon had been installed in 1983, but the Coast Guard still required a keeper for maintenance and emergency situations. Marcus had jumped at the posting. 6 months of solitude, decent pay, and no one to disappoint except himself. The station came equipped with living quarters, a generator, emergency supplies, and a radio system that connected him to the mainland. Perfect for a man who'd lost faith in human connection. The first week passed without incident. Marcus fell into a routine morning equipment checks, afternoon maintenance, evening radio contact with the Coast Guard station. He read paperback novels, cooked simple meals, and watched the endless procession of cargo ships and fishing boats navigate the shipping lane 5 miles to the south. The work was meditative, almost healing. The lighthouse itself was a marvel of engineering. The Fresnel lens at the top weighed over 6 tons, its hundreds of precisely cut prisms focusing the beacon into a beam visible for 20 nautical miles. The mechanism still operated on the original clockwork system, requiring manual winding every 4 hours. Marcus found comfort in the ritual, the weight of responsibility that came with keeping the light burning. But there were signs even in those first peaceful days that something wasn't quite right about Deadman's Point. The seabirds that should have nested on the rocky outcroppings were conspicuously absent. The tide pools that dotted the lower rocks were empty of the usual marine life. No crabs, no sea anemones, no mussels clinging to the barnacle-encrusted surfaces. The silence was complete, except for the wind and waves, as if the area existed in some biological dead zone. Local fishermen avoided the waters around the lighthouse, though Marcus initially attributed this to superstition. Coastal Maine was full of ghost stories and sailors' tales, remnants of centuries when the sea claimed more lives than it sustained. Old-timers spoke of Deadman's Point in hushed tones, crossing themselves when they mentioned the name. but Marcus dismissed their warnings as folklore designed to scare tourists. The lighthouse quarters were Spartan but comfortable: a small kitchen, a sitting area with a wood-burning stove, and a bedroom tucked beneath the stairwell. The walls were lined with logbooks dating back to 1847, thousands of entries documenting weather conditions, ship sightings, and equipment maintenance. Marcus found himself reading the older entries during quiet evenings, marveling at the dedication of keepers who'd maintained their vigil through hurricanes, blizzards, and the isolation that drove weaker men to madness. He should have paid more attention to the entries from the 1920s, when keeper Edmund Thorne wrote increasingly erratic observations about movements in the deep water and shadows that follow the beam. Thorne's final entry, dated October 13, 1927, consisted of a single line repeated 17 times. "It knows I'm watching." Thorne was found 3 days later, his body washed up on the mainland shore, though the lighthouse showed no signs of struggle or abandonment. The first sign of trouble came during Marcus's third week at the station. He was conducting his evening equipment check when the lighthouse beam illuminated something that shouldn't have been there. A fishing boat, maybe 40 feet long, sat dead in the water about half a mile northeast of the lighthouse. No running lights, no radio chatter, no movement visible on deck. Marcus tried raising them on Channel 16, the international distress frequency. Nothing but static answered him. He switched to his high-powered binoculars and studied the vessel through the rotating beam. The boat appeared intact, but something about its position bothered him. It sat too still in the choppy water, as if anchored, though he couldn't make out any anchor line. After 20 minutes of failed radio attempts, Marcus called the Coast Guard station in Rockland. Petty Officer Janet Sullivan, his regular evening contact, logged the report and promised to investigate at first light. Marcus remained at his post, watching the mysterious vessel through the long night hours. When dawn broke gray and cold, the boat was gone. Sullivan called back around noon with disturbing news. No fishing vessels were reported missing in the area. More troubling, the Coast Guard's radar hadn't detected any boat in the position Marcus described. According to their instruments, nothing had been there at all. "You sure about what you saw, Marcus?" Sullivan's voice carried a note of professional concern. "Been feeling all right out there." Sometimes the isolation can play tricks on the mind. Marcus insisted on what he'd witnessed, but doubt began to creep in. 30 years of lighthouse work had taught him to trust his eyes, but the human mind was capable of extraordinary deceptions, especially under stress. Maybe the divorce, the job loss, and the isolation were taking a greater toll than he'd admitted. That night, he paid special attention to the water around the lighthouse. The beam swept its regular pattern: 2 seconds of light, 4 seconds of darkness, the rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Marcus positioned himself at the gallery railing with his binoculars, determined to catch any anomaly. At 2:17 a.m., he found one. The lighthouse beam illuminated a section of water that looked wrong. Instead of the usual choppy surface, the ocean appeared perfectly smooth, as if a massive sheet of glass lay just beneath the waves. The smooth area stretched roughly 100 yards in diameter, its edges perfectly circular. As Marcus watched, the glassy surface began to ripple from the center outward, like something enormous was rising from the depths. The beam completed its rotation, plunging that section of ocean into darkness. When the light returned 6 seconds later, the water looked normal again. Marcus checked his watch and made a careful entry in the lighthouse log: 0217 hours. Observed unusual water disturbance near station. Circular pattern approximately 100 yards diameter. Lasted 6 to 8 seconds. He kept his description clinical professional, but his hands shook as he wrote. The phenomenon repeated itself over the following nights, always in the same location, always lasting just long enough for the lighthouse beam to catch it once per rotation. Marcus began timing the occurrences to 17 a.m. the first night, 2:23 a.m. the second, 2:29 a.m. the third. The timing advanced by 6 minutes each night, following no pattern he could identify. On the fourth night, Marcus positioned himself with a camera, hoping to capture evidence of whatever was creating the disturbances. The digital display read 2:34 a.m. when the beam swept across the target area. This time, the glassy surface was more pronounced, and something dark moved beneath it, a shadow the size of a city block, undulating with purpose. Marcus snapped photos as quickly as his camera would allow, but when he reviewed them, the images showed nothing but normal ocean swells. The camera's electronic eye couldn't capture what his human vision clearly perceived, leaving him with no proof beyond his increasingly detailed logbook entries. The isolation began to weigh on him. His radio conversations with Sullivan became strained as he struggled to explain phenomena that left no trace. She suggested he take some personal time, maybe arrange for relief duty, but Marcus refused. Something was happening at Deadman's Point. Something that required witnessing even if no one would believe his account. Sleep became elusive. Marcus found himself dozing fitfully during the day, only to jolt awake at night as the appointed time approached. His appetite disappeared, and the simple routine of lighthouse maintenance became an exhausting chore. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his hands developed a persistent tremor that made delicate work nearly impossible. The weather turned worse as November progressed. Storm systems rolled in from the Atlantic with increasing frequency, bringing howling winds and seas that crashed over the lighthouse's lower rocks. During these storms, Marcus couldn't observe the usual disturbances, but he sensed something changing in the water around the station. The waves struck the rocks with unusual force, and the lighthouse itself vibrated with impacts that seemed too powerful for ordinary swells. One particularly violent storm lasted 3 days, trapping Marcus in the lighthouse as waves crashed against the gallery windows 60 feet above sea level. The emergency generator struggled to keep the beacon operational as wind gusts exceeded 80 miles per hour. Rain lashed the lighthouse with such fury that Marcus couldn't see beyond the gallery windows, but he maintained his vigil, winding the clockwork mechanism every 4 hours and monitoring the radio for distress calls that never came. When the storm finally passed, Marcus emerged from the lighthouse to find the landscape transformed. The tide had rearranged the rocks around the station's foundation, creating new channels and pools. More disturbing, the water in these newly formed pools was perfectly black, reflecting no light despite the clear morning sky. Marcus dropped a stone into one pool and waited for the splash that never came. The stone simply vanished into the dark water without a sound, as if it had fallen into an infinite void. That night, the disturbances resumed with increased intensity. The glassy patches appeared larger and lasted longer, sometimes overlapping as multiple areas of water took on the unnatural smoothness. Marcus documented each occurrence with obsessive detail, filling pages of the logbook with measurements, times, and descriptions that grew increasingly frantic as his exhaustion mounted. By the end of his 3rd week, Marcus realized he was no longer simply observing phenomena. He was being observed in return. Something in those dark waters had taken notice of the lighthouse, of its keeper of the beam that swept across the ocean's surface with mechanical precision. The hunting had begun, though Marcus didn't yet understand that he was the prey. The realization that he was being watched came gradually, like a tide creeping up a beach. Marcus first noticed it during his morning equipment checks, a persistent feeling that eyes were tracking his movements along the lighthouse gallery. He would pause in his work and scan the horizon, but nothing appeared out of place, just endless ocean stretching to the gray line where water met sky. The feeling intensified during the 4th week. Marcus found himself moving more carefully around the lighthouse exterior, instinctively staying close to the tower's white-painted walls. When he ventured to the edge of the rocky platform to check the tide gauges, the sensation of being watched became so overwhelming that he broke into a cold sweat despite the November chill. The lighthouse beam itself seemed to trigger responses from whatever lurked beneath the waves. Marcus began to notice that the glassy disturbances always occurred when the beam was pointed in other directions, as if the entity below was avoiding direct illumination. This observation led him to a terrifying experiment, manually adjusting the lighthouse beam's direction. The lighthouse's Fresnel lens assembly could be rotated by hand during maintenance, though this required shutting down the automatic rotation mechanism. On the night of November 23rd, Marcus made the decision to interrupt the beacon's regular pattern. As the beam swept past the usual disturbance area, he engaged the manual controls and held the light steady on that section of water. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The beam illuminated normal ocean swells, and Marcus began to wonder if his isolation had finally driven him to complete paranoia. Then, the water began to bubble. It started as a gentle effervescence, like champagne poured into a glass, but quickly intensified into a violent roiling that sent waves crashing against rocks half a mile away. The disturbance spread outward from a central point, creating concentric circles that grew larger and more violent with each passing second. Marcus watched in fascination and terror as something massive shifted beneath the surface, its movements creating currents that defied the natural pattern of wind and tide. The lighthouse beam illuminated these upheavals for nearly 3 minutes before Marcus's nerve broke. He re-engaged the automatic rotation, allowing the beam to continue its prescribed pattern, but the damage was done. Whatever lived in those depths now knew that the lighthouse keeper was more than a passive observer. That night, Marcus heard sounds that had nothing to do with wind or waves. Scraping noises echoed up from the rocks below, as if something with claws was testing the lighthouse's foundation. The iron ladder that provided emergency access to the lower platform rang with metallic impacts, though Marcus could see nothing when he shined his flashlight down into the darkness. Sleep became impossible. Marcus dozed fitfully in his chair during the day, startling awake at every sound, real or imagined. His radio conversations with the Coast Guard grew increasingly strained as he struggled to communicate his growing certainty that something predatory had taken residence in the waters around Deadman's Point. "Marcus, you've been out there almost a month," Sullivan said during their evening check-in. "When's the last time you had a full night's sleep? Maybe it's time for some shore leave." Marcus wanted to explain about the movements in the water, the feeling of being stalked, the sounds that came from the rocks below, but he knew how it would sound. Instead, he assured Sullivan that he was fine and requested permission to extend his tour of duty. The lighthouse needed him now more than ever. The attacks on the lighthouse itself began during the 5th week. Marcus woke one morning to find deep gouges scored in the metal housing around the beacon assembly. The marks were too large and too deep to have been made by birds, and their pattern suggested intelligence rather than random damage. Something had climbed the lighthouse during the night and attempted to destroy the light source. Marcus installed additional security measures, motion sensors around the base of the lighthouse floodlights to illuminate the lower rocks, and a camera system to record any nocturnal visitors. The equipment arrived via Coast Guard helicopter delivered by a concerned crew who noted Marcus's deteriorating appearance, but respected his insistence on completing his assignment. The security system captured images that defied explanation. The motion sensors triggered regularly, but the cameras showed only empty rocks and crashing waves. Whatever was approaching the lighthouse remained invisible to electronic eyes, leaving Marcus with nothing but the evidence of its presence. More scratches on the lighthouse exterior dents in the metal railings, and a growing sense that he was trapped in a predator's hunting ground. The weather turned savage as December approached. Storm systems rolled in from the Atlantic with unprecedented frequency, bringing winds that exceeded anything in the lighthouse's historical records. During these storms, the attacks intensified. Marcus would huddle inside the lighthouse quarters, listening to impacts against the structure that sounded like massive fists pounding on the walls. The beacon assembly groaned under forces that had nothing to do with wind pressure, and twice the automatic rotation mechanism jammed completely, forcing Marcus to brave the gallery in hurricane conditions to make repairs. On December the 3rd, during a brief lull between storms, Marcus discovered something that shattered his last hope of rational explanation. The tide had receded unusually far, exposing areas of seafloor normally hidden beneath 20 feet of water. In the newly revealed terrain, Marcus saw structures that looked almost geometric, too regular to be natural rock formations, too ancient to be human construction. The structures formed a rough circle around the lighthouse's position, as if Deadman's Point had been built at the center of something larger and far older. Marcus sketched what he could see, noting the way the formations seemed to channel water toward the lighthouse during high tide, creating currents that followed no natural pattern. The lighthouse hadn't been built on a convenient rocky outcrop. It had been built on something that wanted to be found. That night, the disturbances in the water changed character entirely. Instead of the localized glassy patches Marcus had grown accustomed to, the entire ocean surface within a mile of the lighthouse took on an oily, unnatural smoothness. The beam's reflection should have scattered across the wave tops, but instead it penetrated the surface like light through clear glass, illuminating depths that should have been hidden in absolute darkness. Marcus watched in horrified fascination as shapes moved in those illuminated depths, not random shadows, but deliberate forms that paced the lighthouse in complex patterns. Some appeared massive, tentacled, and ancient. Others moved with a serpentine grace that suggested intelligence beyond human comprehension. all of them oriented toward the lighthouse beam with an attention that felt personal and malevolent. The radio crackled with interference as these entities moved through the deep water. Marcus's conversations with the Coast Guard became impossible as static overwhelmed all frequencies. His isolation was now complete, trapped on a rocky platform surrounded by intelligences that had been waiting in the dark for over a century, biding their time until someone was foolish enough to shine a light into their domain. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation, no longer a beacon of safety for passing ships, but a signal fire, drawing the attention of things that should have remained hidden in the deepest trenches of the Atlantic. Marcus realized with growing terror that he hadn't been assigned to maintain the lighthouse. He had been delivered to it like an offering to hungry gods who lived in the spaces between water and darkness. As December progressed and the storms grew more violent, Marcus understood that his vigil was approaching its end. The question was no longer whether something would emerge from the depths, but when, and whether he would live long enough to warn the world about what slept beneath the waves around Deadman's Point. On December 7th, during the worst storm in the lighthouse's recorded history, they finally came for Marcus Holloway. The Weather Service had predicted a massive nor'easter, but their forecasts fell short of describing the supernatural fury that descended on Deadman's Point. Waves reaching heights of 50 feet crashed over the lighthouse gallery, sending torrents of seawater cascading down the interior stairs. Wind gusts exceeded 120 miles per hour, and the lighthouse itself swayed like a reed in the apocalyptic conditions. Marcus had secured himself in the equipment room, the most protected area of the lighthouse, but he maintained his vigil over the beacon despite the impossible conditions. The Fresnel lens assembly groaned under forces that seemed directed rather than random, and twice the massive lens cracked under impacts that had nothing to do with wind pressure. At 2:47 a.m., the storm suddenly ceased. The transition was so abrupt that Marcus thought he'd gone deaf. One moment hurricane winds were tearing at the lighthouse structure. The next absolute silence surrounded the station. Even the ocean itself had gone still, its surface smooth as black glass, despite the previous chaos. Marcus climbed to the gallery and found himself looking out over a scene that belonged in nightmares rather than nature. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation, but now it illuminated water that reflected nothing. The ocean had become a perfect mirror, stretching to every horizon, its surface unbroken by the smallest ripple. In that impossible stillness, shapes began to rise from the depths. They emerged slowly, breaking the mirror's surface with barely a ripple, as if the laws of physics held no sway over their ascent. The first was tentacled and massive, easily 200 feet in length, its flesh pale and translucent, like something that had never known sunlight. Ancient scars covered its body in patterns too regular to be accidental, and its eyes, God. Its eyes tracked the lighthouse beam with an intelligence that made Marcus's mind recoil. More entities followed, each more impossible than the last. Serpentine forms that moved through the water as if it were air. Geometric shapes that hurt to look at, directly their surfaces folding in on themselves in ways that violated every law of three-dimensional space. Things with too many arms, too many eyes, too many mouths lined with teeth that belonged in no evolutionary tree Marcus could imagine. They arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the lighthouse, their alien forms barely illuminated by the rotating beam. Marcus realized that he was looking at a conclave, a gathering of intelligences so ancient that they predated human civilization by geological ages. They had been waiting in the deep trenches for decades, perhaps centuries, for someone to call them to the surface with the lighthouse's beacon. The largest of the entities, something that resembled a massive jellyfish crossed with a spider, began to rise from the water. Its translucent bell was easily 300 feet in diameter, and its trailing tentacles disappeared into the depths below. As it ascended, the water around the lighthouse began to rise, with it defying gravity in a display that shattered Marcus's understanding of the natural world. The lighthouse itself groaned under impossible pressures as the ocean level climbed past the rocky platform, past the base of the tower, past the equipment room where Marcus cowered. But this wasn't ordinary seawater. It moved with purpose, flowing upward in spirals around the lighthouse structure, carrying with it the smell of deep trenches and things long dead. Marcus found himself face to face with the jellyfish entity as it positioned its massive bell directly in front of the lighthouse gallery. Its flesh was translucent enough that he could see through to the complex organs within pulsing chambers that might have been hearts or brains' networks of bioluminescent nerves that flickered with thoughts too alien for human comprehension. But it was the eyes that broke his sanity. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, lined the creature's bell in precise rows. Each eye was perfectly human in appearance. Brown irises, white sclera pupils that dilated and contracted independently. But they weren't human eyes. They were perfect copies harvested from encounters stretching back through maritime history. Marcus recognized some of them, the frightened gaze of a ship captain he'd seen in a 19th century painting at the Maritime Museum, the confused stare of a fishing boat crew that had vanished off Cape Cod the previous spring. The entity spoke without words, its thoughts pressing directly into Marcus's mind with the weight of ocean trenches. Images flooded his consciousness, the lighthouse being built by men who didn't understand what lay beneath the foundation stones keepers who had maintained the beacon without knowing they were calling to things that should have remained hidden, ships that had followed the lighthouse beam to their doom in waters that opened like mouths to swallow them whole. Marcus understood now that Deadman's Point had never been a safety beacon. It was a lure, a fishing line cast into the darkness to attract prey. Every ship that had passed safely through these waters had been spared not by the lighthouse's protection, but by the entity's patience as they waited for larger game. The creatures had been feeding for over a century, sustained by the occasional vessel that strayed too close to their hunting grounds. But now they wanted more than random prey. They wanted to expand their influence to spread beyond the isolated waters around Deadman's Point. They needed someone to carry their message to the wider world, to prepare humanity for a larger harvest. The jellyfish entity extended a tentacle toward Marcus, its surface lined with suckers that opened like tiny mouths. Each sucker contained a perfect human tooth. As the appendage approached his face, Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that his choice was simple: become their herald, or join the eyes that lined their alien forms. The lighthouse beam completed another rotation, and in that moment of illumination, Marcus made his decision. Marcus opened his eyes to find himself alone in the lighthouse gallery, dawn breaking gray and peaceful over calm seas. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the usual debris of seaweed and driftwood scattered across the rocky platform. His weather station recorded wind speeds that had peaked at 45 miles per hour, significant, but hardly the apocalyptic conditions he remembered. He stood on shaking legs, gripping the gallery railing for support. The ocean stretched empty to every horizon, showing no sign of the entities that had emerged from its depths. No massive tentacles broke the surface. No impossible geometries folded space around the lighthouse. Just normal Atlantic waters, gray-green under the overcast sky. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, the Fresnel lens assembly operating exactly as it should. Marcus checked the equipment logs and found everything normal: wind speeds, barometric pressure, temperature readings, all within expected ranges. The beacon had operated without interruption throughout the night, its automated systems recording no anomalies. But Marcus's hands shook as he filled out his morning report. The images from the previous night remained vivid in his memory: the rising entities, the impossible water levels, the jellyfish creature with its harvest of human eyes. He could still feel the alien intelligence that had pressed against his mind, could still smell the deep ocean stench of things that had never seen sunlight. His radio crackled with Sullivan's voice during the morning check-in. Her tone carried the professional concern of someone who'd been monitoring his increasingly erratic reports. "Marcus, we're showing some unusual readings from your weather station last night. Everything okay out there?" Marcus stared at the radio for a long moment, considering his response. He could report what he'd experienced, describe the entities that had risen from the depths, warn the Coast Guard about the true nature of Deadman's Point. But he already knew how that conversation would end. They would send a relief helicopter, conduct a psychological evaluation, and remove him from the lighthouse within hours. "Everything's fine, Sullivan," he said finally. "The storm was rougher than expected, but no damage to report." "Copy that, Marcus. You've been out there 5 weeks now. Sure you don't want to arrange for some shore leave?" "No," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "The lighthouse needs someone here. I'll complete my 6-month assignment." After ending the radio conversation, Marcus climbed to the beacon assembly and examined the Fresnel lens. The massive lens showed no damage from the previous night's events, but something had changed. Etched into the glass, invisible except when viewed from a specific angle, were symbols that hurt to look at directly. They formed a pattern that seemed to shift and writhe when Marcus wasn't looking directly at them, and they pulsed with a faint bioluminescence that had no natural source. The symbols were instructions, he realized. A message encoded in the lighthouse beam itself, transmitted with every rotation across the waters of the North Atlantic. Ships would see the light and follow it, drawn by something deeper than navigation instinct. They would come to Deadman's Point, not for safety, but for harvest. Marcus touched the symbols with one finger and felt them warm under his skin. The knowledge that flowed through him was vast and terrible, filling his mind with purposes that stretched far beyond human understanding. That evening, Marcus resumed his duties with renewed purpose. He wound the lighthouse clockwork mechanism with careful precision, checked the beacon's intensity settings, and cleaned the Fresnel lens until it gleamed like a jewel. The symbols etched in the glass grew brighter as darkness fell, their alien mathematics casting subtle patterns across the lighthouse gallery. As the beam began its nightly rotation, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction settle over him. The lighthouse had been calling to the entities for over a century, but now it would serve a greater purpose. The symbols in the lens would modify the beacon's properties in ways human science couldn't detect, creating resonances that would carry across vast distances. He opened his logbook and made a careful entry. December 8th, beacon operating at optimal efficiency. Signal strength enhanced. Expect increased maritime traffic in coming weeks. Marcus had lied to Sullivan about the shore leave for a simple reason: he couldn't abandon his post now. The entities had chosen him not as prey, but as a guardian. Someone needed to maintain the lighthouse to ensure the beacon continued its vital work. Someone who understood what lay beneath the waves and could prepare for the harvest to come. Over the following weeks, Marcus's radio reports grew increasingly enthusiastic. He spoke of improved weather patterns, calmer seas, and excellent visibility that made Deadman's Point an ideal navigation landmark. He recommended that shipping companies route their vessels closer to the lighthouse, emphasized the superior safety record of ships that followed the beacon's guidance. Sullivan and her colleagues at the Coast Guard noted Marcus's improved mood, but attributed it to his adjustment to lighthouse life. His reports were professional and detailed, and the beacon operated flawlessly under his care. They saw no reason to question his growing expertise in maritime traffic patterns or his helpful suggestions for shipping route optimization. The first ship arrived on December 23rd. The cargo vessel Stephanie Marie was carrying Christmas merchandise from Halifax to Boston when her captain spotted the enhanced beacon from Deadman's Point. The light seemed unusually bright, almost hypnotic, and Captain Rodriguez found himself adjusting course to pass closer to the lighthouse. His crew noticed the course change but didn't question it. Something about the beacon felt welcoming, like coming home after a long journey. Marcus watched from the lighthouse gallery as the Stephanie Marie approached the waters around Deadman's Point. The symbols in the Fresnel lens pulsed brighter as the ship entered the hunting grounds, and Marcus felt a thrill of anticipation as the ocean began to respond. The attack came from below with surgical precision. Tentacles emerged from the depths to embrace the cargo ship's hull, and the crew's screams were briefly audible across the water before being cut short. The ship's lights went dark, its engines fell silent, and within minutes, the Stephanie Marie had vanished beneath the waves, as if she had never existed. Marcus made no radio report about the incident. The Coast Guard's radar hadn't detected the ship's presence, just as it had failed to track the mysterious fishing vessel from his first week at the lighthouse. The entity's influence extended beyond the physical realm, creating blind spots in human technology that prevented their activities from being recorded or investigated. More ships followed in the weeks that came. Fishing boats drawn off course by the beacon's enhanced signal. Pleasure craft whose GPS systems mysteriously malfunctioned near Deadman's Point. Even Coast Guard vessels found excuses to patrol the waters around the lighthouse, their crews drawn by impulses they couldn't explain. Marcus greeted each arrival with professional courtesy, waving from the lighthouse gallery as the vessels approached their doom. He maintained detailed records in his logbook, documenting not the ship's destruction, but their successful passage through the lighthouse's protection zone. His reports to the Coast Guard praised the increase in maritime traffic and the safety benefits provided by the beacon's enhanced visibility. By spring, the entities below had grown fat and content. Their circle around Deadman's Point had expanded their influence, spreading along the coastal shipping lanes. More lighthouses would be needed soon, more keepers to maintain the beacons that called prey to the depths. Marcus smiled as he wound the lighthouse clockwork for another night. He had found his true calling at last, and the ocean was vast enough to feed them all. The beacon swept across the dark water, its enhanced light reaching farther than ever before, calling to ships that would never see another dawn.